All right. Hi there, TCC. Welcome to the video series on writing, reading, and research and transferable skills across the disciplines. My name is Yasmin Chahal. I teach in the Writing Studies program. And today I'm joined here by our lead tutor, Lindsay, from the Writing Center. And we are interviewing Professor Sean Boyd from the Math Department. All right.
Hello.
Let me get that first question here. So Sean, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your favorite course to teach, and what is one fun fact about you?
So I actually am officially a tenure track professor now, but I was teaching here for about a year. I was over in the MARC, which is now the SEM Tutoring Center for, gosh, almost 5 years, I guess. I was a student here myself back in 1989 through 1991, and taught here for briefly in 1995. So getting to come back here, I mean, for me, that's kind of a fun fact that I actually get to be here where I got my start and to help other students get their starts. Favorite course to teach? Yes. I I like it's a glib answer and people get annoyed with it, but I haven't found one yet that I haven't really found a really interesting part of, whether it's the subject matter or just getting to work with the students, see the students develop. Sometimes just getting some really neat ideas about how to present things for future courses. So I'm not going to pick one.
I really like the fact that you were a student here and you're coming back. It's like those, I love those good full circle moments. So thank you. Right, so our next question is, for students taking a class in your discipline, what would you like them to know about writing, reading, research in your field? And does writing and reading and research play a role in your teaching?
So, the first thing I would want to say to a student is yes, in fact, math involves reading. And I think students always see that as, oh, I have to do word problems. And it's like, well, yes, you do have to do word problems, but it reading and writing is communication. Math is a language, right? So even if you're adding some vocabulary and sentence structure and maybe a new alphabet into actually putting these ideas together, you're still reading and writing. And so being able to put something in words and lay it out is practice for being able to lay out a mathematical argument. I don't think I've ever met somebody who couldn't do one and not the other.
I really like what
Um,
you say that it's a language. And does writing and reading and research play a role in your teaching?
Absolutely. So first, when I teach statistics, my students do a lot of reading. Just outside of homework problems, for instance, they're working on a term project this quarter, which involves them actually digging to a real research study. So they're having to go and pick something that was published in a journal and pull the information they need out of it. And I'm outside of what we do in class, I'm not giving them a ton of, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do this type instructions. So it's a subject that's fortunately kind of tied to where they're at as students. It involves students at another university and exercise. And so they have some familiarity with the topic and that they are students at a school, but they also get to spend time engaging with this material. And I hope seeing seeing the results that they're pulling out of this study and actually being able to find that as something familiar. The writing, of course, then they have to write what they're talking, what they're reading about. And I have actually sent them Lindsay's way more than once. I want my students to not just be able to see the math, but I want them to be able to put it in words. My advisor in graduate school actually had his take on all this was that, with math, you have to be able to do the numbers and the symbols and the pictures, and you have to be able to tell a story. And I'd like to encourage my students to be willing to put something of themselves in what they're responding to, even if it's kind of a dry research article.
Mm.
I
I
think when
really,
you write it, that's when you know you understand it.
Hmm.
Like if it's all in your head, then, maybe you understand it, maybe you don't. But if you have to put it on paper, then it's pretty clear that you know what you're talking about.
Yes, it's the common phrase that I will get during my daily check-ins with students at the end of class will be, "Oh, I understood, but I'm not sure how to do the problem." And it's kind of the similar phenomenon is really you understand it when you can work through it and explain it and tell a story about it. And the storytelling is something I try to do. It's sometimes it's a little off the cuff and I'm not always coming up with something that's really engaging right at the moment. But I mean if you ever run across good stories that could be math stories, send them my way, please, because they will get used at some point.
I really, it's really informing to know the idea of storytelling in your classroom. That's one of the elements I work on in English 101. And, just this idea that having that skill going into a math class, now that makes me so excited on my end, so I can like filter that your way. So that's really exciting to know.
Oh, it's yeah, it's there's a lot more to the subject than just numbers. It's even when you're talking about something like drawing curves, you can build stories out of that. One scenario that I will give students when we start a certain topic in pre-calculus is I will describe my day, and as we're describing my day, they're plotting where I am, and they're drawing a curve based on a story, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of the applied approach. That's a lot closer to the way you would think about that sort of thing in practice, using math as a tool in the real world than just being given a formula.
I really like that hands-on life experience. And as I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is comprehension, that skill of comprehension, being able to understand, okay, what is this problem asking me, but taking that further. So I really like hearing that.
It's supposed to be the point of the subject, and I think that gets lost sometimes. People want to be able to calculate with a formula, and there's a place for that, but if you don't know what the formula is actually telling you, that's kind of useless.
Mm. All right. So our next question is, what does effective writing, research, and comprehension look like in your field? So assessment.
Ooh, whoa. So math is funny. There used to be there was a running joke in school was that basically writing research articles in math was about seeing how much you could say in as short a span as possible to make everybody else look confused. And it's kind of non-ideal. It's not great communication. So I would look away from, say, professional mathematical writing, and I would look, I think I'd look closer towards a lot of the OER type texts that I have seen, because there have been some awful math texts. I learned from several. One thing I've noticed that the OER texts that our department has started to adopt, uh, there's a little bit more, I think there's a little bit more freedom in the fact that this is a book that is quite oftentimes the intent is just to publish it online. So you are not fitting some arbitrary restriction of you must get this book fitted to 800 pages. So somebody can actually break something down in a far more understandable way. We've got some books right now that are written in English, with some math, but as opposed to being written in math with some English. And believe me, those extremes both do exist.
Mm.
So as far as I think comprehension, maybe you could break down kind of what you mean by that a little bit more.
Yeah, so for students to understand like math problems or just where does that comprehension piece come into it when it comes to as the instructor, how do you effectively see that going on in your classroom? I hope that.
Okay, so we do a lot of group work in my classrooms. So quite oftentimes it will be a result of me setting a problem, setting my students in small groups onto that problem, and then having them respond. So I am oftentimes I'm hoping for a particular answer. Sometimes I'm setting them up for an answer that might not make a lot of sense because I'm wanting them to see where a contradiction to an idea is coming up. And so I'll guide them gently to a roadblock so we can kind of work our way around it. I get written responses from my students, of course, with written homework and the projects and things like that. I have been encouraging my students to do written check-ins on a daily basis. They don't ever have to be perfect, too comprehensive, but I will sometimes get fairly detailed feedback from students at the end of class on things that worked, things that didn't work, things they were confused about. So I guess that's more meta communication, I guess. They're communicating not about the content, but what about the content is, where they're at with the content, maybe.
I really appreciate that reflection piece. I think, I think when it comes to I think in my English courses, that's like a big part is reflection, but I love hearing that in the math setting, to hear that students really putting their voice into saying, this is how I'm comprehending that, this is how I build that connection with the teacher. So that is really cool. And I'm really excited about that. Where was this math class when I was in school? When can I tell you I was struggling? Okay, so our next few questions are actually going to come from Lindsay.
Yes, this is a series of 3 questions, but I'm going to kind of split it into 2. So the first one is for students. What do you recommend to students that are struggling to understand writing, reading, and research in your field?
The first thing I would say to them is that they are not alone. The default state of a mathematician is confusion. That's kind of where mathematicians live, because a lot of the things that we do aren't, even if they're reasonable, they're not necessarily natural, right? We're kind of imposing this structure on reality by doing math. And sometimes that's tough, right? You're creating symbols and you're taking numbers and sometimes the worst thing is you're taking context away from those things and you're being presented this abstract problem. And that's a tough jump for people to make. So the fact that they are struggling, first off, you're in good company. We all do. The second thing I would want them to know after that is that the only way to deal with that is to push through it with assistance as needed. Depending on what the struggle is, sometimes thought and reflection can deal with that. Sometimes it does require an effective tutor who can help somebody break down what something means, or talking to a professor, or just simply working with classmates and being able to argue the matter out.
That actually goes right into our next question, which is for tutors. Is there anything specific you want our tutors to know about your courses? And what can tutors do to empower and help students feel confident navigating your classes?
I talk to tutors a fair bit about that, and particularly with the classes that are somewhat less conventional math classes. So, for example, I'm teaching Math 107 this quarter, which is Math and Society. It's a class that is aimed at folks that aren't needing, for instance, statistics or the STEM track of math for their degree paths. So I have in my class, I've got a whole mix of people, some poli-sci, some literature, some who are a running start and haven't really made up their minds yet. And I have noticed in the past that my student or the tutors that I've worked with are sometimes a little uncomfortable approaching the topics. And I think it's for the same reason that the students are uncomfortable, because yes, reading math for the first time is tough. I would want tutors to embrace it as a learning challenge. If it's something that they are not familiar with, it doesn't mean it's okay to not look at it. Learn along with the student. Be willing to be wrong about something at times. A tutoring space, it's kind of a safe space for being able to make mistakes, right? And to how to say, And it seems cliche to just say lean into and enjoy it. It's the frustration. I know what it feels like to be frustrated with math, but there's also, there's also enjoyment at the end of the frustration. Once you spent that 5 or 6 months, or hopefully only 5 or 6 minutes, really kind of frustrated with something, then there is an aha moment where you go, okay, now this makes sense.
If
And
I understand, like the tutor can like kind of take the pressure off, or the student can take the pressure off the moment, and then once it's kind of that feeling of being elated when you've accomplished something.
Yeah, exactly. And I would, and having sent my students in the direction of the writing center for written projects before, I would encourage writing tutors to the same thing. Is even if they are assisting somebody in writing about a mathematical topic, it's, again, we're back to that. This is, you're still telling a story. And so I would love for the writing tutor to say, well, the math, maybe they've seen it before, maybe they haven't, but let's tell the story. Let's help you build the story from your own perspective, from the student's perspective, and to be willing to embrace it with them.
That's an answer.
Beautiful answer.
So the next one is kind of about skills. What foundational skills would you like students to walk in with? And what do you wish you had known when you had started writing, reading, and research in your own field?
Foundational skills, I would love students to have, boy, that's a good question. I think everybody teaching a class would love their students to come in with every skill that they're going to need, or at least have been exposed to every skill that they're going to need. The tough thing in a community college is that we serve a very wide range of students. I've worked in the same class. I'll have worked with students who have finished a bachelor's degree already and are just taking an extra class because they want to move into a new field, versus students who are coming back and haven't been in school for 10 years in the same class. So while I would love for my students, for instance, to be proficient in basic algebra, say one variable algebra in my Math 107 class, I can't count on that. But there's a foundational skill that we don't mention as often, at least not as a foundational skill. Well, a couple really: perseverance and willingness. So understanding that it might not be always glamorous, but that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and also just being willing to embrace that, embrace the discomfort a little bit.
Really?
I think
What
that
do I
works
wish?
pretty well with what you said before. Like you kind of have to be okay with the in between time.
Oh yeah, it's Andrew Wiles, who was he was the mathematician that proved Fermat's conjecture back in 1993, 94. It was back in the early 90s anyway. Actually has a fairly famous quote, which I will not try to get verbatim here, but he described his journey in math as generally about 5 or 6 months at a time of just not knowing where the heck he was, what he was working on, not knowing the pieces, gradually getting a feel for where things were. All of a sudden, it would just kind of click. And then he was on to the next 5 or 6 month period of not knowing where he was, not knowing what he was doing. And while we don't want that to be, quite that extreme with our students, it's there. And this isn't true in just math. It's, learning is often uncomfortable. And the idea is to minimize the distress that causes, but at the same time, not completely avoid it either. Well, what do I wish I'd done when I started writing in math, and this goes back to that math people don't always write for others. They write for themselves. And I wish when I first started writing things in a mathematical perspective that I learned to take a more conversational, approachable tone with it. I'm very good at spitting out very terse, very sparse, very precise language for a particular argument. And that's all well and good if you're trying to publish in a journal. But since I'm not really doing that, I wish I'd spent more time writing for others to read and learn from and enjoy. So that's still a work in progress here.
I really like hearing that too, just because I used to work with UW engineering, and there was the idea what you just said, conversational. Like you can show them all the bar graphs and the math and the data, and you can show T-Mobile, these big companies, all these things, but it all came down to that conversational tone. How do you sell these amazing ideas to the average person? And
Mhm.
I talk a lot about that with my students, is like getting anyone on board to understand where you're coming from, knowing your audience. And I just feel like the answer. All right. So our next question is, how do you learn about or ask students to reflect on the prior knowledge your students bring to your course? How do you help students identify and describe the knowledge they have learned in your course might be relevant to other contexts, especially as they move through their academic pathways and into the workforce? So put this.
It's pretty class specific, mostly because the classes that I've taught all have really different goals in mind. So, for instance, Math 107, the kind of the underlying theme of Math 107 is to bring topics in math that students might never have even thought of as being math, and do it in a way that exposes how those topics have relevance in daily life. And so the idea there is to, and I've asked this in several homework questions and various topics, is okay, here's this abstract structure we've got set up. See, are there things in your life that actually kind of fit into this? We actually just had a homework finish up here a little while ago where students were asked to kind of dig into their daily routines, whether it was a work routine, home, wherever it was. Think of a collection of tasks that they kind of think of as maybe a cohesive whole, but don't necessarily require this strict A to B to C to D pattern. So, for instance, some people said, well, getting up in the morning versus getting to homework, and all the things that might happen during the middle of the day, and there's dependence relations there. Some things have to happen before others. And then asking the question, if you, in the ideal world, if you had helpers to take care of some of these things for you, how quickly could it all get done? And so asking students, again, this was having them draw back into their personal experience. And with younger students, some of them, it's like, okay, they haven't seen a lot. So it was homework, chores, video games, things like that. Other students were able to look into their actual work lives. Again, I've got students who work construction and things of that nature. So actually had things at work that they were able to say, oh, okay, our scheduling process here at work works kind of like that, and they're able to pull that together. For a statistics class, another class that I'm teaching this quarter, statistics is kind of interesting in that it's one of the few very, very real world classes, I mean, start to finish, that we have in the TCC math department. So many of the scenarios that I pull up, if I'm pulling up a study, I'm wanting students to relate to what they're seeing in the study based on their own experience. When we're doing group work, I'm often asking students to collaborate with each other and talk each other through things. One interesting thing, and this actually just happened today, was we are doing a section on probability. Student didn't know what was meant by a fair die. And I ended up telling a story. It's like, yeah, this is one of those things that this is kind of assumed knowledge for me. I've been doing this for years, right? Very long time. So of course, you know what a fair, oh, but you don't, because maybe, you haven't been around gambling. You didn't have parents maybe that allowed that in the house. You have different language for this from wherever you're from, right? Or maybe you're just not a gambling person. So having students be willing to speak up when they don't know these things, to be able to be willing to talk to each other, just be willing to ask me, and of course me doing better and not making those assumptions ahead of time. So statistics is a fun one in that respect because with a lot of medical students, a lot of medical type questions, those will come in as well. So people will often know results of studies better than I do when we're looking through them. The STEM track is different too. So having taught some 200 level math here, those are folks that when they're taking those classes, it's because they are going to be using those classes later on. It's so the relevance is much more baked into the structure itself. It's like, well, yes, you need to know this because you're going to be taking 5 classes in the next 2 years that it will all depend heavily on this. So there it's then soliciting feedback from the students on, for instance, their majors. Most of them are engineering majors. So trying to find ways of showing them that, in fact, the things that we're defining kind of abstractly have relevance to electrical engineering or mechanical engineering or things like that.
Yeah, I really appreciate one. All right, the next question is from Lindsay.
Yes. So what is the role of AI in your classroom? How do you see students using AI effectively? And does your industry require that students learn to use AI?
So that's one I've been struggling with. I don't have a good answer for that one right now. I have been on the don't use it at all bandwagon. This quarter, I am asking students to, if they use it, I want to just know about it. I can't, kind of impossible to stop somebody from doing it, but at least explain to me how it is that you're using it. I think the most effective use, see, that's a tough one because in math, so the chat GPTs of the world aren't great at math. They're not designed to be great at math. The tricky thing is that there are actually very effective artificial intelligence programs that have been around for decades. One's called Mathematica. And Mathematica will do an awful lot for somebody. And I know there are also others that snap a picture with a phone and have it work a problem through. And so getting students to recognize at first that they shouldn't just take the AI's word for the answer. That I've seen some awful mathematical mistakes just in the past year or two come as a result of somebody just trusting, unfortunately, chat GPT on the answer to a problem that they'd spent hours on trying to find their mistake when in fact their work was fine. It was the software that was wrong. So, but that goes back to critical thinking, right? It's you shouldn't even be taking your professor's word for it in class. It's perfectly okay to push back and question and double check and find alternative sources. So ideally, I would see my students using it as a way of gaining context for something. I mean, it can be a decent search engine at times, maybe a slightly friendlier one to use. I don't mind them using it as a double check if they're really convinced that the software can answer the question and they've got an answer they're concerned about. Sure, okay. It's, you still need to use that critical thinking to be able to see whether or not you're being lied to again. Does the industry require students use it? Probably. I would, I mean, certainly any technology type firm is going to be asking people to use that kind of software to make their work faster and more accurate. The mathematics industry, as such as it is, they're kind of fuddy-duddies about things like that. But realistically speaking, yeah, it's students are going to need to learn to use those tools, and they're going to need to learn that those tools are not always appropriate, that they're not always going to give answers. you know, they're not going to give answers that are accurate. They're going to try to please, right? That's one thing about ChatGPT is it loves to please you. And that comes down to what we do in places like TCC is we need to, and I'm working on this myself, try to find ways to make sure that we're using these tools in a way so that students know what they can be used for and also know that they shouldn't just blindly trust them.
I appreciate this one a lot because what I'm hearing is like knowing that which situation requires these tools. And I myself, I'm in what you said, the bandwagon of don't use it until I figure out what to do with it kind of person right now. I'm not sure
Yeah.
within the English part either. And, what I'm listening to here is exactly that, like ChatGPT does want to please you. And I appreciated that you said that. And that's the thing. It's like what you also said, like, the ChatGPT or the AI will do the problem, but then you did the problem on your own, and it's two different, things. And that critical thinking that is so important. And, that's where I resonate personally. I'm like, I don't want students to lose that. So I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. And the way, I mean, I was even hearing this as I was talking myself around this answer. It's like I don't have a good feel for where the balance really is.
Mhm.
Maybe bringing as much work as I can back into the classroom to see students actually working on something in front of me and then saying, okay, now you've done this rough work right here. Now take it home and refine it some.
Mhm.
I don't know.
I don't think anybody really knows. I think it's new enough that we're still figuring it out, and it's new enough that it's not perfected. So
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would argue not perfectible, but yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. All right. So our last question is anything that we didn't ask that you would like to cover, or is there anything that you would like students to know, or any pieces of advice going into the math field?
Oh, wow. Math is everywhere. I would want students to know that. I would want them to, again, be willing to embrace the discomfort that comes with it because it's worth it. It's even if you going into a math class is purely a goals driven type thing. You got to take that math class for your major and you don't think you're going to use it again. Yes, you might not actually calculate a standard deviation ever again in your life, but under having good number sense is, I think that's an important part of critical thinking. And I come back to that a lot because it's supposed to, I mean, it's kind of the center of what colleges are supposed to be doing is helping foster that critical thinking and then giving our students something to critically think about. So um, lean into the discomfort. That would be my slogan.
Lean in with the discomfort. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as the students that are watching this, math is everywhere. Even if
It
you're not
is.
getting those equations, but just know that from this interview, you got some good stuff here. So thank you again. And I'm going to stop recording here.